you there?
History program, and at this time I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Understanding the 1980s, critical race theory, Afrocentricity, and the culture wars 1980s to 2021. If you really want to understand what's going on right now in current events, particularly in the post-Trump administration, you will not get a full understanding unless you understand the previous decades, particularly the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s. So let's go here. All right, so how did America get here? And this is what we really need to understand. So the culture, strings, and politics is really what we're looking at. So where I'm going to start at is going to be a time period when some of you may have been born, a time period right before some of you all may have been born, and then for the generations who actually lived this, for us, these are just current events. But in this presentation, in this talk, Donald Trump is really not significant to what's going on right now. All right, it was laid out long before Donald Trump actually became president. So I'm actually going to start with Ronald Reagan. So if you really want to understand white conservatism, if you want to understand the politics of the Republican Party, and if you want to understand how the white community codified their politics, we can really look at Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is a very good subject. One, he was governor, and two, he was president of the United States. But you need to go back when Ronald Reagan was actually running for president. One of the things that he did is that he was able to bring white preachers from denominations like the Southern Baptists, Pentecostals, Mormons, and Jews, and he kind of talked to them in a codified language to unify them. Not to unify them in terms of religion, but to unify them in terms of race and culture. So some of the things that was going on in the 1980s, you have to look at the extension of the gay rights movement, the black advancement through politicians such as Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition. So even before we get to a Barack Obama, there is no Barack Obama without Jesse Jackson running for president in 1984 and 1988. The continuous streams of feminism, modern formations and family and community structures, which is fairly new, and then the impact of urbanization on America. What is very interesting about Ronald Reagan is that Ronald Reagan is the first president that the National Rifle Association actually endorsed, right? So the National Rifle Association endorses Ronald Reagan, and they do it at a time right when he was running for governor is when he did, not president, but governor, because Ronald Reagan was governor of California from 1967 to 1975, all right? But what was happening in society at that time is what you have to understand. The rising of crime and urban riots in the 1960s came a push by some of the members of the NRA to organize against gun control. But at the same time, they found a need to begin to fund the police in ways that we've never seen before. So when President Nixon was president, he passed the Anonymous Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. So by this time in 1968, of course, in 1965, Malcolm X was dead. Dr. King also was there, and you have the rise of Black Power. But what is significant about this, there's a term, if you're taking notes, I want you to take down, and it's called institutional memory. So the institutional memory of Ronald Reagan would span from Ronald Reagan as governor to Ronald Reagan as president. So what was started in the late 1960s was continued with Ronald Reagan through the 1980s. So what are some of the things that Ronald Reagan was responsible for in terms of the cultural and political attack on the Black community. So you can go back to when he was governor, and you can look at the founding of the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1965. You can look at Angela Davis, who was a professor in California, but she was a member of the Che Lumumba Club, which was a openist communist club, and they did not like her leftist politics. Also, Angela Davis was in association with the Soledad brothers. So if you don't know about George and Jonathan Jackson, the Soledad brothers, George Jackson wrote the book called Blood in My Eye. Both Jonathan Jackson and George Jackson was both killed. Jonathan Jackson was killed in the attempt to take over a courtroom and take the judges out of the courtroom for release of his brother, George Jackson. And we got the Black Power movement, the gay rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, and the anti-counterculture movement all going on at the same time. So this is in the midst of what we call white flight. So white flight is when white people began to leave the urban communities, taking their tax base with them into the suburbs. So before we get to 1980, there's a period in when the urban cities are being, the resources of urban cities are being removed. And there's a lower social economic class of people who are basically Black and brown who are left there. So these new policing bills. So when we talk about defunding of the police today, right? The reason people are asking for defunding is because the militarization of the police force started in the late 1960s, all right? So we're gonna look at the rise of the Black Studies movement, right? All of this will play into understanding critical race theory. So if you understand the rise of the Black Studies movement, right? And along with the Black Studies movement was the founding of Kwanzaa in December 1966. The reason this is important, because this is the first time that you're going to have curriculums at the university level that is centered on the Black experience. So out of the Black Studies movement will come Afrocentricity, will come Africana Studies. I wouldn't even have my degree from Howard in African diaspora history because the program was implemented in the mid-1960s in terms of granting degrees in African diaspora history. But one of the things that you're going to see in the culture war is the control of education. First, it was the colleges. And then I will show you how it's broken down all the way to the community level today. So white westernized academics, right? So Black Studies professors began to challenge these white academics and their institutions, the institutions that pretty much validated what was known as facts at that time, but not necessarily proven. So what we created is what you call the Communiversity, right? This is kind of what we're having right now. Even though we're in a university, okay, this is the community that is interested in the information in which the scholar is given. So we call it the Communiversity because these are lessons, knowledge systems, books, disseminating information, holding classes that was done in the community, in the Black bookstores, in the churches, in the community centers, all right? So by the community being able to get new information, now the community is able to form a plan of action against various tactics that was used during the Reagan era. Because Reagan as governor, we still had President Nixon who was doing his law and order speech. All right, so let's look at some of the things that Reagan, in terms of institutional knowledge that Reagan would remember as governor. So we get to the 1980s. The 1980s is a rise of new student activism. So if you look at the mayor of New Jersey today, with the mayor, I forgot where Ross Baraka's mayor is, but he's the son of Amir Baraka. But Ross Baraka was at Howard University in 1989 when they took over the administration building. This 1989 student group, who are also part of the rise of this conscious hip hop generation, right? They are as impactful in the community as the Black Panthers were in the 1960s and 1970s, right? So while Ross Baraka was in college in 89, you have me and Tupac who are in high school, right? So that's to give you reference in age. But the culture wars is one that is seen not just within political structures, but is seen within the culture of the people. So I'm going to come to this Newsweek magazine, Afrocentricism was Cleopatra Black, later on in the discussion, right? But you have to think about how we was getting our information, right? So urbanization and the technology that youth had at that time is how the information got out. And for the Black community, MTV and BET and the videos helped us to understand the culture of that particular time, particularly with conscious hip hop music, right? But there were also white shows such as Family Ties with Michael J. Fox, which also show you some of the dynamics that carried over from the 1960s. So here you have the character of Michael J. Fox, who was a young man, about 19, 20 years old, who was a Reaganite. So this period is called Reaganomics, the period in which we experienced deindustrialization, the rise of the American consumer economy, what Reagan called the trickle-down economics, which did not work, all right? And this was an all-out attack on the working class. But more than that, this also gives room for crack cocaine and as well as HIV were the two what you would call pandemics of that time period, right? So Ronald Reagan also had a global reach. We're in a period still where the Soviet Union and the supposedly spread of communism by the Soviet Union was of a great threat to the United States. But we have some vocabulary in the media today that was in the media during the time of Ronald Reagan. One would be reparations. So when you look at the election of Barack Obama, when you look at the election of Donald Trump, and when you look at the election of Biden, the term reparations, particularly by the time we get to Biden, has more of an understanding in the community and just America in general than we've ever seen before. And Randall Robinson is one of the people who's responsible for that. So Randall Robinson had an organization called Trans-Africa, and Trans-Africa made Black people aware of things that was going on globally. So during the time of Ronald Reagan, we're still in the apartheid movement. So if you know about the apartheid and Nelson Mandela is still in prison. He's not out yet. So we have some global reach that also impact us here in America, right? And we give critical analysis to that at the time by understanding how race and law and the government actually impair the lives of people. So you have Maurice Bishop in the New Jewel movement. Maurice Bishop was assassinated by this right-hand man, Bernard Coed. But during the invasion of Grenada is one of the military interventions that happened during that of Ronald Reagan. We have immigrant issues. Now, this is what is very ironic about the immigrant issues, okay? Particularly with the Haitians, all right? So Ronald Reagan had a policy called Interdiction of Haitian Migrants on High Seas, a legal and policy analysis, right? Understanding that Ronald Reagan said, we need to start searching ships for Haitian migrants who are trying to come in through, basically through Florida. So they used to stop ships on the high seas. Well, the contradiction in that is that they did not do the same thing for Cubans. And the reason they didn't, because Fidel Castro was a socialist, right? A communist, a socialist. So the United States gave all of those who wanted to escape the bad or harsh conditions of Cuba, or those who wanted some type of political asylum, all right, they allowed the Cubans to come into the country, but not the Haitians. So in the current event that we're in now, when we had those almost 10,000 Haitians at the Mexican border, this is why the United States cleaned it up so fast. The reason they cleaned it up so fast because it looked bad on America, because we've been here before. So for us who understand what happened in those 1980s and those 1990s, all along through the Clinton administration with Aristide, the turnover of power in Haiti, the United States had its hand in it. So these Haitians and the current event of them being at the borders about a month ago is one that we also can look back in the 1980s and look at the politics of the United States and what you call the Caribbean Basin. All right, now, I'm going to say this, and I've said this publicly before. The Reagan administration were one of the biggest drug dealers in the world. Why do I say that? I say that because it's the proxy wars that the Reagan administration participated in Nicaragua that created the rise of drug lords and the movement of cocaine in mass quantities throughout the world. And a lot of that cocaine ended on the streets of America. So we know people like Freeway Ricky Ross. Freeway Ricky Ross said he didn't know anything about crack cocaine, but he was shown by who he think was an agent how to distribute it. Why is this important? It's important because Ronald Reagan started to draw back on social reforms. These social reforms and programs hurt the Black community. Also, we was going through a point of deindustrialization. So therefore, jobs was hard to come by for working class people. Even college students in the 1980s were having a hard time finding work. Crack cocaine becomes a street economy that anyone who wanted to make money illegally, because it was still illegal, who wanted to make money illegal could participate in. But what nobody asked is, where's all this cocaine coming from? Because it's grown in a country that has to be in a tropical weather, right? Cocaine is not grown in the United States. So how do we get all of this cocaine here on the streets of the United States? Out of this situation give rise to mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, increase in social welfare system that doesn't necessarily help people, all right? However, we also see the fallout of that because we see the rise of special education. And a lot of us participated at some level in special education, either as teachers or as students in this system that ordinarily did not necessarily always help the child. And Black and brown children have been and still are overrepresented in the special education system. Okay, so all of this is connected to the Reagan era. All right, so Reagan himself understood at that time the impact, and white scholars understood the impact that the Black Studies movement had, along with the development of critical race theory. All right, so some of the things you need to understand about critical race theory is that basically what it does is that we give a critique to the institutions in which white people who choose to be racist can hide behind. Why do I say that? You have to understand two terms, de facto and de jure. De facto just means based on normative behavior, acts, and customs. That's what Jim Crow was. A lot of the Jim Crow laws were unconstitutional, state constitutions, as well as federal constitutions, but it was practiced by the culture of the people. So critical race theory has to get into the de jure laws, which mean laws that are instituted by the state. All right. So I'm going to get there a little later when I talk about Charles Hamilton Houston. But what do we have to look at in terms of institutions to give the critique to that so we can have an analysis to fight back? You have to look at the criminal justice system, the education system, labor markets, housing markets, healthcare systems. Racism is embedded within all of those systems. All right. So this brings us still to some of the debates of the 1980s and those decades afterwards. All right, so let's go back to the 1920s. So you have to understand the culture wars are not new. In the 1920s, you had the evolution debate. So when in schools, when we start talking about evolution, just like in world civilization and all of those classes, now we talk about Homo erectus and Homo sapiens sapien. Okay, we don't necessarily use the term evolution, but we talk about the progression of human beings from the lowest species to the highest species. But also embedded within the debates of evolution is that of inferiority and superiority of the human race. All right, so long before we get to Hitler, because Hitler take his playbook from the United States. So when you go into the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you would see how Hitler just did not think that the Aryans were superior over the Jews, but it was Jews, gypsies, anybody who they deemed not of good quality, people who were gay. Hitler wanted all of those people not within the German society. Right? And a lot of this playbook come from the earlier American debates between German scholars and American scholars. And within this, you still have the Judeo-Christian worldview. Okay, so let's go to 1980. Madonna, her song, Like a Virgin, right? That was played on MTV. It was brought out during that of the Grammys. We're still a very conservative Judeo-Christian America where the shape of Judeo-Christian values is one that carry over from the Victorian era, all right? And it did not necessarily reflect the culture of that time. And that created great conflict. The Ebonics debate, right? So in 1997, within the Oakland school system, they wanted to use what you call Black vernacular language, what we call Ebonics, as a primary language and English as a second language, so that way you can transition those who speak in their ethnic dialect into what we call modern standard English. All right, that was a big debate, and then that debate lasted for a long time. And it did not start in 1997. The article that I pulled up was from 1997. It actually starts in the 1970s. All right, this brings the controversial over bilingual education in American school. We have people who could not accept that in certain regions of the country, people of Spanish descent were going to dominate the language. You go to parts of Florida, you go to Texas, you go to California, okay? They have a very strong Chicano, Hispanic, Latin America heritage, because part of those regions used to be Mexico, used to be under Spanish rule for a very long time. All right, the ongoing debate of school curriculum. This is where we are today with critical race theory, right? The last stronghold, or one of the last strongholds, in terms of community control, are the public schools. So really what we're speaking about now, we should be learning in 11th and 12th grade, right? So understanding this, the ongoing curriculum debate, whether or not African-American history, women history, gay history, European history, or Native American history, how it should be taught in public schools. So what's ironic about African-American history, the state of Virginia just passed a resolution that now all teachers who are graduating with a teacher certification must have African-American history. Every teacher that needs a continuing education credits for recertification must have African-American history. That's a great thing. But what the state did not say is that every student in the state of Virginia would take African-American history. All right, so it's still a little play on power to understand that. But there is a coalition that's been very active in Virginia, and I believe that that is going to be the first move. And right now, Virginia is very progressive in making that move, but it's a long time coming. Think about it. We, as people of African descent, in terms of what is recorded in the British colonies, have been here since 1619. We've been here on the on the East Coast in terms of the Dutch colonies since the 1500s, the Spanish colonies of Florida, right, since the 1500s. So we, as people of African descent, were here before some of these Europeans got here, was here during the colonial era, and have been here ever since. We have greatly influenced this country in more ways than you can imagine. So why we don't have African-American history in school, which is American history, because it happened here in America. So critical race theory makes the prism through which its proponents analyze all aspects of American life. So we have people today who do not want to accept what white people have done in the past. It's not an indictment of white people today, right? It's not to make white children to feel as though that they are responsible for the actions of their ancestors. But what it does or will do is to teach not only American students, but white students how to be critical of institutions that impact and oppress the lives of people. So you have to get down to what's really going on. So this is the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So before I talk about that, let's go over here to the right. We have Malcolm X, we have Billy Graham with President Nixon before he became president, when he was running for president. Why is this important? Malcolm X said that you must study your open enemy. At this time, Malcolm X was not in the Nation of Islam. He was out of the Nation of Islam, and he began to teach Black nationalism. He said his arch enemy was a white nationalist. You could find this on YouTube on the tape, The Ballot or the Bullet. And you can still buy CDs of Malcolm X speeches, which The Ballot or the Bullet. Listen to what he said, the ballot, meaning the ability to vote, or the bullet, meaning at some point, if these conditions don't change, then we're going to have to take more extreme and aggressive action, right? So this was 1965, before Malcolm was assassinated, February 21st, 1965. But we have Billy Graham here. This is the first unification that you see in a long time of white evangelical politics that merge with a higher level of white politics. Okay, so this brings us back over here to the critical race theory in the classroom. When you look at the terminology up here, these are the concepts that they do not want to be taught at the high school level. You cannot teach history in America without using some of these concepts. Equity, diversity, and inclusion. Donald Trump, one of the things that Donald Trump did was remove the funding for equity, diversity, and inclusion training in the federal government, right? I don't know if it's been reinstated yet, but every institution, if you think of, has a department that deals with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Cultural and multicultural competency, that is what Virginia has in their new bill. All right, I've already sent out letters to be a cultural competency coach, right, to the various school systems. Understanding social justice and restorative justice. What is social justice? Social justice is what you've seen in terms of Black Lives Matter. Social justice is what the Black Panthers was fighting against when we talk about police brutality and community control of the police. We could look at some of the other areas, talking about white privilege, white supremacy, right? White privilege and white supremacy are very real concepts. There are aspects of human life that people who are classified as their status as white, who are European descendants, who are here in America, have a particular advantage or have had a particular advantage longer than the access that people of African descent has had, right? So we look at terms such as colonialism. Now think about this. The United States was founded based on the 13 colonies. These colonies were sent here by Britain to be the economic engine to send resources and wealth back to Britain. When the colonies no longer wanted to be under that oppression, they rebelled against the King and Queen of England. So how do you not use the word colonialism or neo-colonialism, which we see in parts of Africa and parts of the Caribbean? So let me go down to number 17, Afrocentric and Eurocentric, all right? And I'm going to talk about this a little later, okay? It is very apparent that the people who are trying to shape this is playing on the ignorance of the people who are following them. Afrocentricity, Eurocentric are terms that are used by both white and Black scholars, have been used for a very, very long time now. But they know that the public does not know that. Okay, of course, reparations and ethnocentricity. The entire planet is ethnocentric. That means you belong to some aspect of an ethnic group. You can't say that everybody belongs to a racial group, because a racial group is a social construction in terms that is found here in America. So they say, I'm Black. I'm Black because I'm a person of African descent. However, in terms of ethnicity, right, I can't tell you what my lineage of ethnicity would be, like most Black people, but what I can tell you is that those ethnic groups, the Igbo, the Akan, the Fulani, the Hausa, the Ibobo, the Iwe, okay, are people who were brought from Africa to be enslaved here. Over time, new social construction of identity emerged. All right, so this is why they don't want you to use this language, because this language gives you framework to the history of the past. So let's go to some of the most radical people in terms of looking at critical race theory. We give critical race theory a lot of credit in terms of the law, but what we don't give critical race theory a lot of credit in terms of Black consciousness. All right, so when you understand what Black consciousness is, that means that you understand who you are as a person of African descent, whether you were a proud colored man, a proud Negro man or woman, a proud Afro-American man or woman, Black American, African American, and then we know in today's time, the term African Americans have various definitions to it, right? We got those who are African American because of heritage and culture such as myself, right? Then you got people who are of Nigerian American heritage who were born here in America who say, I am Nigerian American. They too are still African American because they are of a particular heritage, ethnicity, and descent. But it's the system that we want to understand, and nobody taught this better than Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. So if you have not read her first book, The ISIS Papers, and then the reflections of her work, because she passed away maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, the Osiris Papers, what is it that Dr. Welsing wanted us to know? All right, is that the global white supremacy system is not one of individual white people. It is codified behavior in every aspect of human life. So she lay out economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And the global system of white supremacy oftentimes is referred under the cloak of Western civilization. So when we say Western civilization, basically what the textbooks say, the land in which people of European descent came here to the West to build this new civilization. All right, they shaped it, they formed it, etc. in order, that is Western civilization. So the attack of white identity is also an attack of Western civilization. This is how a lot of people feel. So when you get a chance, and I'm going to give Dr. Stevenson these slides, go back and watch the debate between Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and William Shockley. All right, this was on the Tony Brown's Journal back in the 1970s. William Shockley, who was not a geneticist, basically said that Black people are inferior just based on the conditions that we're born in and perpetuating ourselves through birth in those conditions. Dr. Welsing is one of the people who debated him. You could go back and look at information on the bell curve in the 1980s, which was a book, right, which stated or attempted to try to state and codify why Black students were naturally inferior in the classroom. They didn't want to look at the system of education. They didn't want to look at the racism, the prejudice, the misinformation that is inside of the textbook. They didn't want to look at the pedagogy or the praxis of teaching children who was birthed and have the legacy and heritage of their ancestors and immediate forefathers. All right. So that is what you have to be able to understand. So we have white people that believe that the system of white supremacy is under attack, which is true, right? We have an obligation in every aspect of our lives to break down white supremacy so we can have a system that is humanistic for all people who live in America. That gives us equity, equality, inclusion, diversity, and all of the other terms that we use within those frameworks to bring forth what we actually want to see and do. Okay, so it's a fight for multiculturalism. And right now we're still in the 80s. I mean, I didn't even do any of the 90s up here because we just don't have time. But this is what carried over from this period, from the late 60s all the way to where we are now. So we have Dr. Wade Noble, all right? So Dr. Wade Noble in the book, A Fusion of Afro-American Content in the School Curriculum. This book came out after the conference in 1989, okay? In 89, what they wanted was a new curriculum, but it's hard to get a new curriculum because it has to be approved by the state. Then it has to be implemented all the way down to the school district, which is a big fight, right? So basically, if you look at what Wade Noble would say about multicultural education, one is interdisciplinary in its process rather than a single program, right? It is designed for the development of human dignity and respect for all people. But within the definition, a lot of concepts embraced by cultural pluralism. America is a country that is pluralistic in every aspect of its being. Think about this. We could go to an Italian restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, a Vietnamese restaurant, Ethiopian restaurant. We could go to a Mexican restaurant. How is it we're able to go to all of those different restaurants? Because the people represent the ethnicity of the food in which they brought their culinary or food ways with them to this space. That's pluralism. You have a choice. You may not like Mexican food, you just don't have to eat it. But there's no reason to ban it, right? There's no reason to say that Mexicans can't come into the country because you don't like Mexican food. Some people even argue it's Chicano food. We don't use the term Chicano anymore. That's another culture war. And you got to ask yourself why we don't use the term Chicano. Reason is because the term Chicano referred to the people mainly of the Southwest who are native and indigenous to that space. They were here for generations, for centuries. So they switched this Chicano and we started using terms as Hispanic, Latin American, etc., with not giving very good respect to the ethnicity and the culture of these individual different people who intersected this Spanish space, whether you're Puerto Rican, Filipino, they have Spanish names, they were colonized by the Spanish. So we live in a pluralistic society. Ethnicity is also important. Intercultural studies, intergroup, and human relations. This is what multiculturalism does. So why would certain segments of the white community be against this? You can't have white supremacy. You can't have white supremacists and white people protecting those institutions if their children are taught a different ethos, a different worldview, a different way of being human. All right, this is why it is a big threat, okay? So, and this comes back to the argument of state rights, curriculum control, and local school boards. Local school boards have tremendous power before a change can get to the state. The change usually does not start with the state. The change usually starts with the local school boards. Go on YouTube and just punch in critical race theory and school boards. Look at how mad some people from the white community are about critical race theory, and most of them don't know anything about critical race theory. But I'm going to show you where they're getting that information from in a few minutes. Okay, so let's look at the battle over multiculturalism. All right, so one of the things that we have to look at is the intellectual warfare. So Jacob Carruthers is not alive, but the Jacob Carruthers Institute is. So you have his book, Intellectual Warfare. In the middle, you have the picture of the late, great Dr. John Henry Clark. And on the right, you have the book, Not Out of Africa, how Afrocentrism became an excuse to teach myth as history by Mary Lesovitz. All right, so let's look at this. The advocates of an African-centered curriculum and similar approaches to multiculturalism have been engaged in intellectual and academic warfare. So before, the debate was really started off between academics, people who had PhDs who are working in the academy, universities and colleges and other think tanks and institutes. They're battling it out. Why they're battling it out? The supremacy of Western thought. Because there's a such thing as Black Western thought, just like there's a such thing as European Western thought, or let's say Asian Western thought. All right, these are all aspects of belief systems, worldviews, institutionalized knowledge, and etc. Okay, so when people become threatened, now they began to attack what they fully do not understand and what they fear. So no one thought that the Black Studies movement was going to be an academic discipline that would last in the academy. Can you believe it? They never thought that Black kids wanted to take a Black history course in school, African American history course, Black women's course, a Caribbean history course, a Africana studies course. All right, so they kind of laughed at it, shunned at it. But there was a generation of scholars who directly attacked scholarship that undermined right information, okay? All right, so go to YouTube, watch the debate between Dr. John Henry Clark and Mary Lesovitz. You would see exactly what I mean with that, okay? So let's bring it into the 90s a little bit, all right? And then bringing it into the 90s, we have some overlapping movements that are going on that was very progressive for the Black community. All of these movements engage race in some way. The first would be Dr. Malafi Ashanti. So if you can see my cursor, that's Dr. Malafi Ashanti right there. I believe he retired, but he founded the first African-American Studies program at Temple University. All right, you have me as a young person, 1985 through 1991, I graduate high school. You got the group X Clan. All right, I put their video down here from YouTube, fucking lessons, right? That is what taught me history. I didn't learn history in school. I learned a lot of history through two mediums, reading, MTV, BET, the videos that they showed at the time. All right, one of the books that was impactful for me in high school was the book Kaffir Boy by Mark Metherdane. Right, it gave me great insight into what apartheid was and how the system of apartheid were oppressing Black South Africans. The book Color Purple was a very significant book because Alice Walker and many other Black women writers began to engage in gender debates on the history specifically and the experiences of Black women. For those who are in the history program and those think about Dr. Stuckey and what she does, this is really a new phenomenon that have Black women now with PhDs in history. You go back to 1980, it wasn't a lot. 1960, it wasn't a lot. Even in the 1960s, we had Black men with PhDs in history, not many women. All right, so the Association of Black Historians is founded within this continuum. Okay, and then two political factions that come together in order to maneuver within the Democratic Party. That would be Reverend Jesse Jackson, who ran for president in 1984 and 1988. Jesse Jackson Rainbow Push Coalition would bring more Black people into the Democratic Party. Some people at this point in time may say it's by, you know, we may need to go back and look at what Black politics mean to Black people in terms of the Democratic Party, because before this, we were really moving somewhat in certain sections of society to a more independent Black political base. But Jesse Jackson used that base, and Minister Farrakhan used the grassroots base of the teachings of the Nation of Islam along with positive hip hop culture. That is the only reason that the Million Man March in 1994 was able to occur, right? So I'm sticking with my time here. So where are we in this debate here in terms of multiculturalism? One of the people that I'm writing about, or I'm waiting for it to be published now, is called Scattered Africa, Tony Martin's rejection of the concept of the African diaspora. And I wanted to know, why did Dr. Martin reject this concept? One of the reasons he rejected this concept, because he believed that Black history in no way, in any form, he was a Caribbean scholar, should be associated with terms that is associated with Jewish history and scholarship and concepts. Why is that? Because in the 1980s and 1990s, the relationship that the Jewish community had with the Black community began to break down. So there were two books that came out that caused controversy. The first book is called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which was produced by the Nation of Islam. The second book would be The Jewish Onslaught, which would be writings of Dr. Tony Martin addressing Jewish scholars who are deemed classical scholars who did not like what they call Afrocentric or Afrocentricity. Do not get confused Afrocentrism, which does not relate to Black people at all. That is how white scholars frame Afrocentricity. So what Afrocentricity says is that we, as people of African descent, need to look as far back to our antiquity in terms of our history and culture. So what is left for us would be what we can start at, and that would be in East Africa. So you can go from Uganda, I think it's Lake Victoria in Uganda, all the way through the Nile, those 4,000 some miles up to the tributaries of Egypt, because that is where Black life can be found in its oldest dated sense. All right, this created much controversy because now scholars who deemed themselves to be classical historians felt that this was a threat, and it started with them within the academy, but they couldn't control it because it spilled out onto the street. So what they didn't realize is that these Black scholars, who I've been in the presence of Tony Martin many times, all right, Tony Martin was the type of scholar who would come to a cultural center, whether it was 15 people there, 5 people there, or 200 people there, he's going to go through his scholarship. That's the type of scholar that he was, right? But these scholars, what they needed to do was overturn the misinformation that was being put out. Now, you have to think about the world before the internet, before social media. How will people get their news? They will get their news through either watching TV. The Phil Donahue show was a very important show in terms of bringing issues of the time to the general public. All right, but we got news publications like Newsweek was Cleopatra Black, right? So then we come over here to a most recent one. I use this in my class all the time. National Geographic, the Black Pharaohs. This is Taharka. You can find Taharka in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, right? So Taharka was the last king of the 25th dynasty, right? So they say the Black Pharaohs because we recognize that the majority of the pharaohs were Black pharaohs, but then there were other people like Cleopatra. There were more than one Cleopatra. There was about 9 Cleopatra. Cleopatra the first through like Cleopatra the 9th. It's Cleopatra the 7th in history that most people pay attention to, all right? Because that Cleopatra is more of the Egyptian type person you would see today, all right? But let me tell you a little bit about this National Geographic. National Geographic received death threats. They received very nasty comments from the white community. The same thing with the History Channel. The History Channel had the series called Barbarians. One of the people who they showed was Hannibal. Hannibal was a Black man, right? So you had people who, because they did not know that these people was African descent, and they were giving a different image of who these people were, they now believe that people are falsifying history. And this is just not true, all right? The History Channel is a very, for the most part, when they do real history, not like alien stuff and things like that, when they do real history, all right, they are pretty credible, okay? So I posted the article of commentary on it, and one of the things that the person in the commentary said is that it's not whether or not Hannibal was Black or not, because they know he was Black. He felt as though that the History Channel did not give enough time in really getting you to understand who Hannibal was as a military leader. If you go to the Army War College, like all colonels in the US Army have to go to the Army War College, or they may go to the Navy War College, right? They study Hannibal. They even study Shaka Zulu, okay? Because these are 2 military leaders who were authentic in their military command strategy and how they fought in battle. But once people see these things and they've never been exposed to it before, now they're actually afraid of what they're seeing. Okay, so let me go through a little bit of the concepts in this paper that I have, and then we're going to end up with Charles Hamilton Houston. So one of the things that I say in the paper is that Eurocentric pupilists or popular media outlets fear that African-centered thinking and Afrocentricity will become common among the Black masses, and it did. It became common because we got to a point in American history where we had outlets that were not controlled by white media. And the Black bookstores of the 80s and the 1990s were the primary place to get your information and actually sit down, meet, study, and talk with a lot of these scholars. Okay, understand what that is. All right, multiculturalism arising in the context and stemming from the Black studies movement all the way down to what we used to call study groups. Okay, so we couldn't learn these things in school, so study groups was formed. So ASCAP, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, in the 80s, those scholars said, we're going to form study groups all in these cities throughout America. So I was a part of study groups at Norfolk State University in the 1990s, right? The early 1990s. And then when I got back out of the military, I studied with other study groups. Sometimes we traveled, sometimes it was here local, because you have to think, we don't have the internet. We don't have social media, but we did have VHS tapes, right? Recorders, where these scholars would record and sell their lectures and teachings and their courses and their programs, and we followed them that way. That was the only way that we could actually follow that work. All right. So in understanding that, the hip hop generation continue the work of the 1960s, and that hip hop generation give the foundation for the millennials, which also bring forth Black Lives Matter and other activist groups. So these, what I call obviously the young people, those who are younger than I am, right? Those who are in their late 20s, early 30s, the older millennials in their late 30s, right? This is the generation that I was teaching when I started teaching in 2005 in 3rd grade. They grew up and they continue some of the same activist formation by the information that they're giving, and they have access to the internet. So now this is why you see things moving at a faster pace than you see before, because now people have access to information that they did not have before. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the slide here. All right, so how do you understand critical race theory? Most people like to start with Derek Bell, and I would tell them, do not start with Derek Bell, right? The reason is you need to understand the course and the trajectory that get Derek Bell to where he is. You have to start, in my opinion, you have to start with the late, great Charles Hamilton Houston. All right, Charles Hamilton Houston is the teacher of the first Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, because Thurgood was his student at Howard Law School. So critical race theory starts with Charles Hamilton Houston. So you can go to the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, which is at Harvard Law School. Charles Hamilton Houston in 1919, roughly 1919, he came back from World War I, and he decided to go to law school. He went to law school and he graduated from law school. So we all were able to go to integrated schools. We're able to go to integrated schools, have public accommodations, because it's Charles Hamilton Houston who set the foundation for the 1954 Browns versus the Board of Education ruling, right? So when you understand that, you have to understand a couple of things that happened even before Charles Hamilton Houston was born. So the picture that you see here, that is Plessy Ferguson. That is Plessy, right? So Plessy is considered a Black man, or at that time, a colored man. He was quote unquote 1/8 Black, that's what they say. He wanted to sit at the front of the train car. They would not allow him. He got arrested, so he filed suit. By him filing suit, his case goes to the Supreme Court. All right. So basically what it says, it goes to the state Supreme Court, Louisiana first. And basically what they said is separate but equal is law. And basically what it's saying is no Black man have any rights that any white man is bound to respect in terms of the law, is what it says. All right. The underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument consists of the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. So I put inferiority in red because inferiority is one of the terms that they do not want taught in school. Black people was put in an inferior position based on the power structure of white people. Now that's a fact. So Thurgood Marshall and Kenneth and Mamie Clark, they did the white dog test and the black dog test. And not all of their findings, but in some of their findings, what they found is that Black children, by the time they entered elementary school, already had an inferiority complex of being Black because of the images they saw in media, because how they were treated in American society by the white population. Okay, so it is this Supreme Court decision that lasted from 1895, roughly 1895, 1896, until 1954. Charles Hamilton Houston was not even born until 1895. Not only was he not even born until 1895, but this is a changing point in Black American leadership. Frederick Douglass dies in 1895. Booker T. Washington comes, and he has more of a accommodation to white power structure type philosophy. He was not the progressive type leader. I understand why he did it, which is a totally different conversation, right? But Mr. Douglass was more progressive and saying, no, we need new institutions. This is why we have HBCUs, right? This is why we had the Freedmen's Bureau. Mr. Douglass was an advocate for Black people all around this country in terms of increasing our access and reducing white supremacy and power as much as possible for that time period. Booker T was a little bit more of accommodationist. And then you see W.B. Du Bois come in with a little bit more intellectual reasoning of why we need to push for more aggressive society in terms of breaking down these structures. But that system lasts a long time. All right. So Charles Hamilton Houston, who was trained as a lawyer, also was the first editor of the Harvard Law Review, and I believe Barack Obama was the editor as well. Okay, and not only did he get a law degree, but he additionally got a degree, the Doctor of Judicial Science. Why is this important? This is important because Charles Hamilton Houston did a study, and he found out that throughout America, that Black lawyers was in ratio of 200,000 to 1. So there was one Black lawyer to every 200,000 Black people. So what he said needs to be done is that we need to train lawyers to break down white supremacy through the law. And that is what comes back to critical race theory before you get to bail, right? So this is where you see Thurgood Marshall and you see Boswick, who played Thurgood Marshall in the movie Marshall. But if you look at the case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that is like the beginning. But Brown versus the Board of Education is not one case. Brown versus Board of Education are many cases in which Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP legal team went to all of these different localities, winning in the state courts, which they now had enough winnings in terms of legal rulings on their side to go to the Supreme Court. Now, this is the irony in this. Charles Hamilton Houston died at 54 years old, 2 years before the Brown ruling came out. He had 2 heart attacks, I believe. Now, Thurgood Marshall had about 2 or 3 heart attacks over his lifetime. I know he had 1 heart attack before he even became Supreme Court Justice, before the Brown ruling himself. So these men were under tremendous stress, right? But they put in the work, they put in the time, they trained these lawyers, and these lawyers was able to bring lawsuits at the local level, at the state level, building up to the Brown case. So if you look at Griffin versus School Board of Prince Edward County, that was right here in Virginia, right in Prince Edward County, right here in Virginia. The governor in Virginia closed the schools because he didn't want to integrate the schools when he was forced to integrate by law. All right, that is the type of climate that those men were working in, okay? So it's the law itself in which we can look at probably the longest record. Now, I started with like the 1980s, went back a little bit to the 1960s, went back a little bit to the 1920s with Charles Hamilton Houston, but you can go all the way back to Black people during the times of the Black codes in the 1680s, the 1700s, the 1800s, who were in court fighting for their freedom in some type of way. And believe it or not, there were people who actually won for various reasons. Let's say you had a slave owner who said he was going to emancipate you, right, after 20 years. Let's say he gave you a document, a legal contract. He had it notarized, all of those type things for that time, right? And he gave it to you, right? We have people who would take those type of things to court and say, I should be free. Sometimes the court may uphold it, sometimes they may not. But one thing that is for sure is that it's in public record through the court records. So when you look at Derek Bell, critical race theory, what they do is draw off of critical legal studies, all right? But from the aspect of critical legal studies, they began to draw theories, analysis, and action as it particularly pertains to the Black experience. And that would be the social construction of what we call race, all right? So this is why I didn't talk a lot about Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is actually very insignificant. Donald Trump is actually very insignificant to what we are experiencing and what we're seeing today in terms of critical race theory, public reaction to critical race theory, the understanding of multiculturalism in America today, all right? Most people would tell you that they would have never thought that there would be a such thing as same-sex marriage in America. With the deep-rooted Judeo-Christian values of America, it was not within the worldview of most people, to include myself. But what is it that people had to respect? We had to respect the civil liberties of other people. All right, now I believe there's still other constitutional issues in terms of how we define marriage in various ways. So for myself, I'm a Muslim. In the Quran, it says that as a Muslim, I can have 1 to 4 wives, right? And let's say I wanted to have 2 wives. Can I have 2 wives legally in America? And if I can't, why not? All right, I will have to lay a foundation within public record of theory, law, and reasoning within that law. And something else that you need is popular or public opinion. So as public opinion changes, the law can change. Okay, so by giving the public new bodies of information, new systems of information, you're able to attack the system itself. And that's really what critical race theory is really about, all right? And it's not just about law. It's in every aspect of human life as it regards to the system here in America. You can do the same thing for gender studies, and there are other area studies that also use critical theory to explain the relationship between that group of people and the culture and society in which they live. And I will end this here for questions.
Any questions? If anyone has any questions, you can either type them in the chat, or if you would like to ask the question, I can certainly just simply unmute you. Any questions or comments?
All right, come on, talk to me, talk to me.
Okay, let's see. There is Barry Ward. Let me
Barry, go ahead.
Allow you to talk, Barry. Okay, Barry?
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Barry.
How you doing, Dr. Tarik?
Oh, pretty good, sir.
I wanted to ask, what do you think, because I joined in when you were talking about the essence of Reaganomics. How did Reaganomics impact Black communities during the 1980s?
Okay, all right, so first let me say this, right? Not only did Reaganomics impact the Black community, Reaganomics impacted working class people overall. So what happened is we have deregulations that are taking place in the housing market, in the banking market. And we have what you call deindustrialization going on. So this is what you call a lag. So you end up with a economic lag, a educational lag, and a skill gap. So the change in society can't fulfill the needs of the people faster than the change is taking place. And that's where the lag coming at. So where if you take a young man such yourself, you wouldn't have needed to go to college. Even in the early 1990s, I had plenty of friends who went to work in the factory. They worked at Gwaltney's food processing plant. Some of them even retired from there. They went and worked at the Ford plant, which is now closed down. So at this point in time, the jobs that Americans would have are now being taken overseas and what we know as outsourcing. This greatly impacts America. Another aspect of Reaganomics is that a lot of tax breaks was given to the rich and nothing was put back into the tax base of the public. Okay, so you also look at the impact of urbanization and suburbs. Suburbs, the creation of suburbs were not necessarily good for the urban area. And the reason it took the tax base out of the urban center and put it into the suburbs. So the suburbs become about home ownership. And discrimination in housing prevented people from home ownership. Home ownership is an aspect of how we transfer wealth in America, sustain wealth in America, is through ownership of property, ownership of businesses, etc. All right, so Reagan was a staunch conservative. Some of the programs that was put in place, he was governor in roughly 1967. So Lyndon B. Johnson in the Great Society had created the biggest social reform since FDR, who was president during that time. And what people did not see in the 1980s was how they were going to be able to advance economically in American society. And this is why the selling of drugs in America became big business. Now, we do focus a lot on the impact of drugs in the Black community, but really what has been ignored is the impact of drugs in the white community at that time. We do know the aspect of when they began to criminalize drug dealers. They criminalized those who were selling crack cocaine versus those who had powder cocaine. So you can have large quantities at times of powder cocaine and not get the same amount of time that you would get for crack cocaine. All right. President Obama actually overturned some of those federal rulings. Even Donald Trump did. I know people right here in the Tidewater area who was pardoned by Donald Trump because of the over sentencing that occurred to them in the 1990s. And we're talking about 30 and 35-year sentences, 25-year sentences, and these were not major drug dealers. They were just, unfortunately, guys who made bad decisions, in which they thought they was forced to use this avenue for money, right? So, but truly, the Reagan era is very, very complicated. You really would see if you could find a documentary that can lead you to the books of Ronald Reagan of the 1980s.
Thank you, Dr. Tarik.
Thank you, Barry. Are there any other questions, comments? Any other questions, comments? Lindsay Key and Tiffany Packard mentioned they would like to have a copy of the presentation. I'm sure that won't be a problem.
Yes.
I have a question, then I know it's time to go, Dr. Tarik. Let's see. What do you think the role is of HBCUs in promoting supporting, promoting, whatever the word may be. I'll use the word promoting. um, critical race theory from an administrative perspective, and obviously from a faculty perspective. What is the role of HBCUs in particular?
Well, from my experience, I don't expect much from the administration. All right. And I say that because, I mean, you know the answer to this. All right. So historically, when Black students were the most radical in the community, even when we go back to the sit-ins in North Carolina that occurred, those students from North Carolina A&T were suspended. They were expelled from school for upholding their rights. We find this to be the same at North Carolina A&T, at Howard I think it was the 1969 student takeover, 1970 at Norfolk State College when they had the group called the Vanguard. Anytime students were the most radical, even when it was necessary, there was some type of repercussions from the administration. And the reason is the administration is tied to the state. So for instance, when the shooting occurred in Elizabeth City, there was a split in terms of social media and who approved police being housed on an HBCU campus with those who agreed that it was okay because they were going to service the community, right? So we know historically, anytime Black students have come in contact with police on college campuses, whether it's HBCUs or other, Black students don't fare well in that engagement, right? So I really don't expect a lot from the administration. In terms of faculty, you never really have had a unified faculty. What you really have are very progressive people who are faculty, who tie in to the community in terms of community programming, whether it's moderate, radical, militancy, or whatever type of service the community want them to provide. Now, Prairie View University has a social justice program. Howard University does service learning. So during spring break, students, they went to Louisiana or New Orleans to help with Katrina, right? Right now, we are forming a social justice task force at ECSU, okay? So where I see it going, I really can't give you assessment on it, but what I would tell you is that I really don't have a lot of faith in the institution itself to bring about the change that the people need, because usually that change comes out at the community level and they force the institution to recognize the change that need to be made. The Black Studies movement did that. Those students set in for Black Studies, all right, which grew. If those students would have done that, we had administrators who didn't even think it was necessary for students to have a mandatory African-American history class, or at that time, a Black Studies course, right? So to end the question, what I would say to students, whatever you believe that needs to be done in the community, you can go and do it, but understand not everybody's going to support you, and there may be some backlash for what you do. And don't be surprised at all if that began to carry over from the community back to the college campus. There definitely may be some backlash from administrators on that. Hopefully, administrators will have a better understanding of the history of Black students to the administration, to kind of do it like Kathy Hughes did, who's the owner of TV One. All right, when the students in 1989 set in, the student building at Howard University, you had various big figures like Marion Barry, Kathy Hughes, Rock Newman. They were the liaison between the students and the administration. Without that happening, the police were just going to storm the building and move all the students out by force.
Appreciate that. Professor Cynthia Morris said, what are some things students can do at ECSU? Or do
Well,
in
one of
Elizabeth
the
City, pardon me.
in Elizabeth City? That is a great question. What I would like to see the students do is to build a bridge between ECSU and Elizabeth City. Okay. The university belonged to the people of Elizabeth City and particularly to the Black community. So, like, I know our students were greatly engaged in voting registration. Well, now we have to move this voting registration off campus and into the high schools, into the middle schools, into youth clubs, right? Youth organizations, so that they can know and begin to learn why they need to vote. Another thing I would like to see students do is to see where there's a need of service. And a need of service can be almost anything. It could be finding out, talking to principals or leaders in the community and having a coat drive. All right, having a health fair. Okay, going into the community and understanding the needs of that community, not only in Elizabeth City, but also the communities in which you all come from. All right, having a greater social responsibility for change. So one of the things that I hope that this presentation was able to do is inspire you to now pay more attention to current events. Watch the news. Okay, not only watch the news, but look at alternative news sources, BBC News, Al Jazeera News. Okay, you can watch the Chinese news channel, which is in English. Okay, listening to various podcasts about what's going on around the world. All right, because all of these things greatly impact us. Why hasn't the Clinton Foundation provided more aid to the Haitian community? And it was their foundation who raised more money in donations than almost any other group. So why Haiti? And we understand they've had various earthquakes and hurricanes, but there's something that created the population push of the Haitians to pull them to the American border. All right, just understanding that gives you a better understanding of the society that you live in. And as a person of African descent, I always teach to inspire Black students to develop a greater level of Black consciousness. All right, so Black consciousness doesn't exclude any other people in terms of us indicting them for who their race is. No, Black consciousness make you aware of who you are as a person of African descent, historically, culturally, politically, and socially to the state in which we live. That is what Black consciousness does. It makes you more aware, and it gives you a cultural framework to work from. So that's like the term ethnocentric. They want to ban the term ethnocentric when all people on the planet are ethnocentric. Japanese people have a Japanese worldview. Chinese people have a Chinese worldview. There's nothing wrong with that. We all are entitled to our right of having a worldview that help us understand how we engage as human beings in these social systems.
Any other questions, comments? And thank you, Dr. Tarik, for this phenomenal lecture. And we could go on and on and on. You reminded me of some books that I hadn't read in a while. And by the way, to your point, not one of those books you mentioned had I ever been assigned to read from undergraduate to the PhD program.
I agree.
That's a sin and a shame. But anyway, thank you to all faculty, staff, and especially students who have participated in this, and we appreciate it. Our next and final webinar for the semester is on Thursday, November 18th, where we will have a lecture Education and Empowerment, Building Solidarity Through a Critical Lens by Dr. Joy Banks at in the School of Education at George Mason University. Thank you, everyone.
Good. Thank you.
Hold tight, Doc.
Okay.
Let me stop this recording.